Okay, my name is Josh Ryan. My talk today is called Veto Powers, Override Thresholds, and Policy Outcomes Constituting the Vigor of Executive Authority. I'm going to present some research that's part of a larger project with two other assistant professors, Rob McGrath at George Mason and John Rogowski at WashU. There's been a renewed interest recently in studying the executive and understanding how executives interact with legislature, what constitutes a strong executive relative to a legislature. This research moves beyond traditional political science work on the executive, especially on the presidency, which tends to focus on individuals and personalities and historical contexts and that type of thing. What I'm going to try to do today, and what I think on executives is doing, is making inferences based on generalizable conditions, systematic and empirical evidence. So I'd like to start by briefly talking about how presidential systems are designed. Presidential systems, like the U.S., the federal government, and like the state governments and the governments in a number of other countries. The two things that characterize presidential systems is, first, there are separated lawmaking powers. That is, the legislature is in charge of making laws, the executive is in charge of enforcing laws. These powers are separated, and each branch has its own sphere of influence, so to speak. The second thing that characterizes presidential systems is that each branch also has the ability to prevent the other branch to exercise a negative power over the other branch, that is, stop the other branch from doing something. The framers talk about why they did this, why they set the federal government up this way. Federalists and Phillips famously, they explain their reasoning. They were afraid of two things. They were afraid of tyrannical majoritarian legislature. They feared that legislatures tend to move toward imposing their will on unpopular minorities, tend to move toward abusing their power. But they also feared executives. They feared that executives, of course, when you imbue too much power into one person, that person can become either dictatorial, they can turn into a demagogue. So the framers, by doing this, by separating powers and by adding checks and balances, what they're hoping for is they're hoping to strike a balance between legislative and executive power. And of course, they mention this in a number of places, especially in Federalist 51. And they say, having checks and balances, having the system of separated powers, this is the way in which each branch is going to guard itself and guard the other branch, guard itself against the other branch as well. One of the most important, if not the most important, formal power given to the president is the power of the veto. The talk is called Constituting the Vigor of the Executive Authority. This is a phrase that comes from Hamilton's Federalist 73, and Hamilton's talking about two things. First, he's talking about the inability of Congress to change the president's wage. That hasn't turned out to be as important. And the second thing is the veto. And the veto is designed, again, to provide the executive, which was perceived to be a weaker institution, with some power against a potentially more powerful legislature. So in the Federalist Papers, the framers talk about the veto as being a shield to the executive, as protecting the executive and allowing the executive to protect the people against the inaction of improper laws. It gives the executive its own sphere of influence, its own powers. But the veto is also qualified. The executive does not have an absolute veto. That is, veto in the US Constitution can be ridden by 2/3 of a vote of both the House and the Senate. There is nothing magical about that 2/3 number. Again, in Hamilton Federalist 73, he talks about what the veto override threshold should be. He says, well, an absolute veto seems to be the most obvious way to grant the president a lot of power to ensure that the president's able to defend himself against a more powerful legislature. But of course, he says this is likely to lead to abuse by the president. He says it would neither be altogether safe nor sufficient, and of course, it might be abused. And again, that's the fear, that's the tension that they're working with, is how much power to grant to the president in the form of veto, how much power to check the legislature, but at the same time, how much power should the legislature be able to have back with respect to a veto override. Jefferson, by the way, in the Declaration of Independence, the very first complaint he lists is that the king has refused his assent to laws. That is, the king has basically exercised an absolute veto over laws passed by colonial legislatures. And keep in mind at this point, the framers also have some bad experience with royal governors in some of the states who also have the power of an absolute veto. This has the understanding the implications of a 2/3 veto override vis-a-vis some other potential veto override has implications for a lot of other presidential systems. Most of Latin America has presidential systems. Argentina, Chile, and Mexico, for example, all have 2/3 override requirement, just like the United States. While Uruguay has a 3/5 override requirement. That is a lower override requirement, 60%. And other countries like Brazil, Colombia, and Peru, they all have 50% plus 1 override requirements. Now, the framers seem to think that this would make the executive weaker, a lower override requirement. And they actually debate, is 2/3 appropriate? Should we make it 3/4? But despite their inclinations or their intuitions, we actually don't know a lot about how the veto and the veto override threshold interact to produce executive power. That is, how do override requirements along with the executive veto shape legislative outcomes, and how much power, as a corollary to that, how much power do they give the executive? What I'd like to do today is I'm going to develop a theoretical framework for answering some of these questions. This framework is going to draw on 2 other theories of executive-legislative relations. One is the pivotal pollux theory, most famously articulated by Crable. This is the idea that we can array people along a single dimension, and the idea that, well, in a separated system, a certain set of actors has to agree. Because we've got bicameral legislatures in this country, and we have an executive, we have to get at least one member of the chamber median in a majoritarian legislature to go along with policy change, as well as the executive. And if not the executive, then the veto override pivot. That is the key actor in the legislature who can override a veto. The second theory I'm going to draw on is the idea of bargaining between the legislature and the executive. And the key insight of this bargaining literature is that vetoes are an important tool because both the legislature and the executive have common expectations about the use of the veto. They understand that a veto exists. They understand that an override is possible. And even though we don't observe vetoes, because the veto exists and because executives can threaten to use a veto, the legislature can threaten to override, legislatures and executives will account for the strategic interaction while they're bargaining over policy, over legislation. In other words, we don't have to actually see a veto or a veto override for these to be powerful tools. They are built in a sense, into people's lawmakers' strategic expectations. I'm going to develop a theory off these 2 ideas. I'm going to test that theory. I'm going to test a theory of veto and override requirements. I'm not going to do it at the national level, at the US federal level, because of course there has been no variation at the federal level. The veto override requirement has been 2/3 since the founding. It is difficult, although there's a lot of interest in this in the comparative literature. It is also difficult to do across presidential systems. There's a lot of different institutional rules. There may not be similar historical or cultural context, and these differences make drawing inferences difficult. The way I'm going to do it today is I'm going to use the US states. There is actually quite a bit of variation in US states in terms of the veto override requirement for governors, for state legislatures facing a governor. And in fact, this provides an opportunity because states have very similar rules, because they more or less have the same culture, the same institutions. This is going to provide us a pretty good opportunity to test theories of veto override requirements in relatively similar systems. Now, this is a map of the United States, and it shows the variation in veto override requirements by states. You'll notice there are in fact 6 states in this country that require only a 3/5 veto, and there are 5 states, there are 7 states that require only a 3/5 veto, and there are 6 states that require only a majority plus 1 veto, what I'll refer to as a majority veto. And it's not just the smaller states that have these different institutional rules. As you can see, both Illinois and Ohio, 2 relatively populous states with large economies, have a 3/5 override rule. Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, these are all states with majority override rules. So there's quite a bit of variation at the state level, and this variation has real-world implications even today. For example, North Carolina did not even have an executive veto until 1997. They adopted their first veto in 1997 as a result of lobbying by the governor. I'm going to talk more about this case in just a second. Right now in Alabama, they are beginning a constitutional convention. It's not all that uncommon for states to revise their state constitution. One of the things that the governor, Bob Bentley, is pushing is he's pushing for Alabama to increase its override threshold from a majority to something higher, a 3/5 or 2/3 veto override requirement. And he says, in Alabama, the veto at this time has some meaning, but not a lot of meaning. In other words, he suspects that his majority override, the majority override requirement in Alabama, makes him a weaker governor. In Illinois right now, a guy named Bruce Rauner is running for governor he's a Republican against the incumbent Pat Quinn. It's a very close race. We'll see what happens in a couple of weeks. It's possible Rauner may win. Rauner actually, as part of his campaign, got a ballot initiative introduced that would have raised, one of the things it did is it would have raised the veto override requirement from 3/5 to 2/3 to align with the rest of the states, as he says. So Rauner makes the claim to the voters of Illinois. He says, because the governor is the only statewide elected official, raising the veto override requirement helps ensure the best interests of all Illinoisans are represented. Rauner may be the first gubernatorial candidate in history to try to expand his powers before he's even elected. Unfortunately for him, the state Supreme Court just threw this off the ballot, not about a week or two ago. But Rauner said this is something he's going to try to push for. So if he becomes governor, again, he's going to try to raise the veto override requirement. He thinks it's an important component of executive power. So the way we're going to examine the importance of the veto override requirement is I'm going to look at the size of winning coalitions, and I'm going to explain the connection between winning coalitions and override requirements in a second. We can't actually directly measure gubernatorial power based on the veto override requirement, but we can measure the size of winning coalitions. Now, winning coalitions suggest a couple things. As the override requirement increases, that should produce a larger winning coalition. Why? Because if there's a situation in which the governor is going to veto a bill, the state legislature should gather more lawmakers into the winning coalition to prepare for a potential override attempt. And I'm going to demonstrate how we could make different empirical predictions based off a 50% versus 3/5 versus 2/3 override requirement. So the main theoretical expectation is that larger override requirements are going to promote larger coalition sizes. And if in fact we do see larger coalition sizes in states with a higher veto override requirement, that would suggest that it is actually empowering the governor in these states and it's producing different types of policy. This expectation is going to be conditional on very different executive legislative preferences. And again, I'm going to show this formally in just a second. But the basic idea is that when the governor and the legislature have very similar policy preferences, a veto will not be necessary. We shouldn't observe larger coalition sizes. So the way I'm going to do this, the way I'm going to demonstrate this prediction is I'm going to use a one-dimensional spatial model. This is typical of the pivotal politics literature. I'm going to assume the veto override legislator is pivotal. That is, the governor will veto. The veto override pivot, the 2/3 or 3/5 or 1/2 person legislator has to go along with the new policy if the policy is going to become law. They vote for the policy closest to their ideal point. And I need to assume as well the governor's preference is exterior, that is far away from exterior to the veto override pivot, far away from the chamber median, farther away than the veto override pivot. And I'll demonstrate this in a second. One more important point, when we're thinking about the sizes of legislative coalitions, the smaller the legislative coalition that passes the policy, the more extreme the policy is. And again, this can be shown formally, but if you think about what happens when you have a bare majority passing a policy, most legislators, a majority of legislators are in favor of the policy, but a lot of legislators are against it. And that's because the policy is moving too far for their liking. It's moving too far away from that. As the legislative coalition expands, more legislators have to prefer it, which means the policy is likely to be more moderate, at least relative to the status quo. So let's look at a spatial model, and this is a situation in which the chamber median and the veto override pivot are the same person. That is, this is a majority override requirement state. I've labeled the chamber median's ideal point It's right in the middle of that space. There are also the veto override pivot. And notice the preference of the executive is far away. The executive is far to the right of the chamber median, is also the veto override pivot. And what this particular model is going to predict is that a policy is going to be passed by the chamber median, the executive is far away from it, they're going to veto it, and then the chamber median is simply going to override that veto. Now, we have to assume here that policy is to the right, the status quo, excuse me, I should say, is to the right of the chamber median. It's going to be moving to the left. That's the direction the chamber median is going to want to pull it. The executive is not going to like that because it's moving farther away from them. And so they'll engage in a veto. The winning coalition, that is the minimum number of people who have to vote in favor of this bill, is going to be everybody from the chamber median to the left. And the reason is because everybody to the right of the chamber median, they may prefer the status quo because the status quo is going to move past them, closer to the chamber median than they are. Now, it's possible that you could have larger winning coalitions, but we can't predict the exact size of the coalition. We can only predict that this will produce, we can only predict what the minimum winning coalition is going to be. And when we do this empirically, we're going to have lots of votes. We can measure the size of coalitions on average. So let's look now at when the veto override is 3/5. The chamber median here is still in the middle, but notice they are no longer the veto override pivot. The policy, the status quo, is going to be to the right of the veto override pivot. The chamber median and the veto override pivot are going to want to move it to the left. And as it moves to the left, the veto override pivot will become more predisposed. Once it gets closer to the veto override pivot, they will vote for it. But notice what happens here. The smallest possible winning coalition when the veto override pivot is 3/5 is everybody at the veto override pivot's ideal point into the left. You'll notice this is a larger minimum winning coalition than the case of a majority override, because it includes, now the winning coalition includes everybody from the chamber median to the left and some people to the right, because the right, that area needs to include more legislators. Also notice I've marked gamma. Gamma is the gridlock interval. Once policy enters in that space, it can't be moved because the veto override pivot will prefer the old policy on any move to the left. The chamber median will prefer the old policy on any move to the right. Of course, when we look at the 2/3, the logic is exactly the same. You'll notice the size of the winning coalition has increased again. Why? Because everybody from the veto override pivot to the left is indifferent once policy moves toward the veto override pivot from the right to the left here. The veto override pivot must vote in favor of that policy. So they're going to need to vote in favor of it, as is everybody else to the left. That's going to make a larger winning coalition. Empirically, then, we should see larger winning coalitions in 2/3 states versus 3/5 states versus majority states. To put this another way, to put this in a simpler way, the idea simply is that the larger the veto override requirement, when the governor is far away from the chamber median, when they're exterior to the veto override pivot, we will have larger winning coalitions. If, by the way, the governor is not, if they're in the gridlock interval, then the gridlock interval will change because they become pivotal, and we can't make these predictions. So this requires that the executive is far away. Okay. The way we're going to do this, the way I'm going to demonstrate this is I'm first going to use the introduction of the veto in North Carolina. North Carolina had a veto introduced in 1997, and I'm simply going to compare coalition sizes between 1996 and 1997. Now, it's important to note, as I mentioned, that the governor, the executive's preference, must be far away from the chamber median's preference. Unfortunately, we don't have a way of directly measuring that. So I'm going to use divided government as a proxy. The theory itself is nonpartisan, but divided government is a situation in which it's likely the executive and the chamber are going to be far away from each other. So simply put, I'm going to look at coalition sizes in North Carolina pre-veto and coalition sizes in North Carolina post-veto. Luckily for me, North Carolina has divided government during this entire term, during this entire period, I should say. The governor doesn't change, the House doesn't change, the Senate doesn't change. The only thing that changes between these two terms is the introduction of the veto. Now, you'll notice one other possible thing that could be happening here is the governor maybe has a mandate, maybe legislators are more willing to go along with him. There's no evidence that this is the case. As part of this project, we actually read newspaper articles in North Carolina. There's nothing that says the governor had a mandate. It was kind of business as usual in North Carolina between these two terms. So really importantly, the only key institutional difference that I think could be driving these results is the introduction of the veto. So the way we collected these coalition sizes is we actually looked at the votes on paper as part of this project. We coded them up. And here we go. We see that in the House and the Senate, coalition sizes, in fact, increase in both chambers at a statistically significant level, the 0.05 level, from pre-veto to post-veto. One of the other things I want to say that's commonly done in this literature is varying the cutoff size of the coalition. That is, we can look at all winning coalitions, that is, all bills that are passed in the size of the winning coalition. Problem is that can confound the results because a lot of those votes are what we call hurrah votes or apple pie votes. That is, they're non-substantive votes. So one of the techniques is we actually look at increasingly controversial votes. In North Carolina, in the House and the Senate, for unanimous votes, there is a statistically significantly larger coalition size post-veto than pre-veto. In the Senate, if we look at votes that won by 0.95, 95% of legislators or less voted in favor, but these are slightly more controversial. The Senate is statistically different at 0.1. Not a huge difference, but part of the reason is we just don't have that many Senate votes. You can see in the distribution there, we have less than 100 Senate votes in the data. They just didn't have that many votes. And so as we start reducing the winning coalition size, we end up with fewer and fewer votes. This is pretty strong evidence that the introduction of the veto in North Carolina had a pretty significant effect on the types of bills, the types of winning coalitions that were put together. Now, since we've used North Carolina, now what I'd like to do is simply just examine cross-sectionally differences between states that have majorities, 3/5 and 2/3. So what I did is I'm going to use roll call votes, final passage votes from General Bright's data. He collected data on all all votes, recorded votes in all state chambers between 1990 and 2000. The reason it's just this one term is it's incredibly difficult to get roll call votes for all the states. As part of this project, we actually went through and coded only final passage votes. We read the description. Each vote had a short description of it. We read a short description, decided if it was a final passage vote. This was fairly easy to do, although quite time consuming. We had to eliminate some states. Some states we didn't have enough data on, or we didn't, I should say the vote was not descriptive enough to allow us to code it as a final passage vote. We're going to use states that do not have off-year elections. States like New Jersey and Virginia have off-year elections. That means the legislators are different in 1990 and 2000 because they had an election in between. Can't use those states because too many things have changed. And our key independent variable is going to be indicators for the veto override threshold. The winning coalition cutoff we're going to use is 0.75. Because we have lots of votes, we can use a little more stringent cutoff. We're trying again to screen out those apple pie votes. In fact, 0.75 is admittedly an arbitrary cutoff. A lot of other analysts do this. They use something lower, like a 0.6 or 0.7. We have to use at least 2/3 because that's the coalition size we would predict in 2/3 states. By the way, the results hold almost exactly if we use 0.7 or 0.8. It doesn't make that much of a difference within a range. And here's what we find. Again, we're just going to look at divided government. That is our proxy for a difference, an important difference between the executive's preferences and the chamber's preferences. And in fact, in the first model, we simply dummy out supermajority states and compare them to majority override states. We find a statistically significant positive increase on coalition sizes. In the second model, we have two different dummies for 3/5 and 2/3. Again, we find a statistically significant increase. And these are percentages, so we can interpret these as percentages. So a 3/5 override requirement is compared to a majority override requirement, increases coalition sizes by about 1.7%. 2/3 override requirement increases coalition sizes by about 2.1%. The average state legislative chamber is about 110 to 120 people, somewhere in there. So we're talking, for a 2/3 override requirement, we're talking coalition sizes of about 2 to 3 people, larger than in majority override states. And that's somewhat of a substantive increase. And again, larger coalitions produce more moderate legislation. Okay. What I suggested so far is that the veto override requirement increases coalition sizes, that larger veto override requirements force the legislature to put together more moderate bills, and they force the legislature to create larger coalitions. Now, let's look at it from the governor's perspective and perhaps thinking about if the veto can actually be a positive power. Most of our conceptions of the veto are of it as a negative power. And again, to return to Hamilton in Federal 73, he says a qualified negative. Vetoes have the effect of returning bills, of preventing their becoming laws. But it seems like the veto could be more than that. It's a bargaining tool, but it's conditioned by the override. It's a qualified bargaining tool. What I expect is that as the override requirement increases, the governor becomes more powerful. Why? Simply because it becomes harder to override a veto, and perhaps more importantly, even if the veto is overridden, that veto override pivot is going to be close to the governor's preferences. So as the number of legislators needed to override a veto increases, executives should be more successful in passing their preferred policies. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to use the budgetary process. There's a couple advantages of using the budgetary process. First, budgets are very important in the states. It's among the most important things that states and other governments do, and importantly, budgets produce clear measures of executive preferences and clear measures of legislative preferences. Why? Because the governor in every state, just like in the US government, actually gets to propose, make an initial offer to the legislature of a budget, and that represents basically, well, their preference, their ideal point, if you will. If the legislature takes this budget, they can modify it, they can change it in ways they see fit, but then the governor has the opportunity to veto that budget. And I say down here in the last bullet point, budgetary data is good because it gives us an empirical estimate of the governor's preference. Other research on executives has used things like batting average scores. This is common in the comparative literature as well, and these scores basically say when the executive takes a stand on a bill, how often does it passes. The problem is these scores are endogenous, they're strategic. We would expect executives to take stands in favor of legislation when it's most likely to pass, for example. They can't do that with budgets. Every state has to pass a budget either every year or every other year, just like in the US government. To come back to our formal model, I just want to demonstrate formally again, and I can go into more detail about this if you'd like during the Q&A, that executive preferences here are going to become more important as the veto override increases. To return to our example of a majority override state, the executive can propose a budget at E, the chamber meeting is going to pass a budget at their ideal point. The executive is going to veto it. Doesn't matter. The veto override pivot and the chamber meeting are the same person. That's the budget they can override with. And in fact, that's the budget we're going to end up with. Now, if we go to a 2/3 override, that veto override pivot is much, much closer to the executive's preferences. Even if that budget is overridden, even if the governor's veto is overridden, because the veto override pivot must be satisfied and they're going to be closer to the executive, we should see a budget that is much closer to the executive's preferences. And of course, 3/5 is going to be somewhere in the middle. The data is time series cross-sectional budgetary data. It comes from the fiscal survey of the states. They actually collect data on proposed budgets by governors and then eventually enacted budgets by the governor and the state legislature. We need to account for some state-specific rules, some quirks in the budgeting process in a couple states, some other things. Many states require a supermajority to pass a budget. It's not like a normal law. We have to account for that. I'm going to actually run different models to account for that, for supermajority budget status, supermajority budget states in those states. There's an alternative theory here about budgets from Kiewit and McCubbins. They use, rather than using a ideological model more consistent with pivotal politics, they use a distributive model when it comes to budgets. This simply says, the short version of this is that governors should be more powerful only when they prefer to spend less than the legislature. So just as a robustness check, I'm also going to run models that limit the sample to when governors propose less than is eventually enacted. to see if we see the same effects from veto override. And again, I can talk in more detail about that. But it's basically a robustness check to account for their other model. Okay, so the independent variable here is the existence, well, the override threshold, either a majority, a 3/5, or 2/3. The dependent variable is going to be the absolute difference between the governor's proposed budget and the enacted budget per capita. Here's some data on proposed and enacted budgets. You can see and this is per capita data, by the way, you can see they track pretty closely, although there's some important differences. You can see that per capita spending has generally increased over time between 1987 and 2011. You can see the dip from the Great Recession starting in 2009. In fact, here's the cross-sectional model. The first two models are different specifications of the same idea. Model 2 includes states that require a supermajority to pass a budget. These are states like California, Illinois, a couple states. They actually require a 2/3 majority to pass a budget. So we count that as a 2/3 requirement. Model 1, we just exclude those states. And then we see models 3 and 4. These are situations. This is a subsample, and the governor proposed less than enacted to account for Kiewit and McCubbin's distributive model. The results across all 4 models are almost exactly the same. And in fact, these results hold up in other specifications as well. They're quite robust. And what they tell us is that having a 2/3 override requirement is an important determinant of whether the governor gets what they want in budgets. Now you'll notice we don't see effects for the 3/5 override requirement. There's a couple possible explanations for that. One is that there are not that many 3/5 states, and a lot of them also happen to have supermajority override requirements. So the effects might be being washed out by that. We see that they're all going in the right direction, but they don't reach the level of statistical significance. This seems like it's an empirical problem more than a theoretical. We just don't have enough empirical leverage on these states in this particular situation. In terms of substantive effect size, the budget's changed by about 20 to 30. I should say governors are more successful by about $20 to $33 per capita. To take a state like Alabama, which has a majority override requirement, and Alabama has almost the exact same population as Louisiana. That means the governor of Alabama, Bob Bentley, is about $96 to $158 million less successful than, say, Bobby Jindal. That's a pretty large substantive effect. And I can tell you that, as we saw at the beginning, Bob Bentley would like to have a higher override requirement, and he would do better in his budget proposal. To sum up, do states with higher veto override thresholds have larger winning coalitions? Yes, they do. Yes, we've demonstrated. I've shown you a theory and empirical models that suggest that coalition sizes get bigger in anticipation of a potential veto as the override size increases. But it's conditional on differences between the executive and the legislature. Does the veto empower the executive during the budgetary process? Yes, we find strong evidence that it does when the override requirement is 2/3. The evidence is not as strong when it's 3/5. Again, I think this is an empirical problem. It's hard to get leverage on that rather than a theoretical one. Now, to talk about some substantive implications, are override requirements important? Yes, they are. Just ask these 3 governors. On the left, we have Jay Nixon, governor of Missouri. In 2013, Jay Nixon's a Democrat. He faces a unified Republican legislature. They actually have a 2/3 majority. Missouri is a 2/3 override state. In 2013, the legislature passed a number of anti-tax bills, a number of conservative policy bills. Jay Nixon vetoed them all. The bills were so conservative that a handful of Republicans defected. They didn't vote for the bill. The winning coalitions were not 2/3 sized because the legislature didn't believe that Nixon was actually going to veto them. He did. They came back this year. Among other things, among the more controversial bills they passed was a bill to allow teachers to carry concealed guns in the schools. They moderated the bill ever so slightly to capture those Republicans. They made sure they had a 2/3 veto-proof majority on the bill. Nixon vetoed this teacher bill, this teacher gun bill, and the legislature overrode it, using the same number they did to pass it. In the middle pane, we have Mike Beebe. He is the governor of Arkansas. Arkansas is a majority override state. Mike Beebe faces a Republican legislature. He vetoed this year a voter ID requirement. It's been called the strictest, toughest in the nation. Mike Beebe vetoed it. And in fact, the legislature simply overrode his veto by majority. If Arkansas had a 3/5 or 2/3 override requirement, they would not have been able to do that. The last pain is Beverly Perdue. She was a Democratic governor of North Carolina. In 2012, she vetoed a number of bills, including the budget. North Carolina is a 3/5 override state. She had a number of these bills, including one that would have made it easier to engage in fracking in the state. She vetoed that bill. That bill was overridden by one vote. The pivotal vote actually was a Democrat who voted to override her veto, and then as soon as she did it, she said, oops, she made a mistake. Didn't matter. But importantly, her 2012 budget was, she vetoed the bill passed, the budget passed by the legislature because of significant cuts to education. Governor Perdue vetoed that bill, and it was overridden again by one vote. Do these veto override thresholds matter to these governors? Absolutely. In terms of broader conclusions, these veto override thresholds can give and take power from the governor based on how high they're set. This is also evidence for the nature of the bills that are passed, the policies that are passed. Are they extreme? Larger coalitions imply more moderate policy. And larger coalitions exist as a result of a higher veto override threshold. Even though, in fact, higher veto override thresholds increase the gridlock interval, they produce, when they do allow policy to be passed, they produce more moderate policy. The veto provides both positive and negative power to the governor. It is a component, as we saw with budgets, of gubernatorial power. When they know they have a high veto override requirement in their state, they're able to do better with respect to budgets. This has lots of implications for how politics works in the states and in this country and in other presidential systems. It has implications for executive popularity, the power of the executive, their ability to bargain, the rate of policy change, and the types of policies we're going to end up with. So I would argue that the veto override has been overlooked, but the framers were onto something. They had a sense that the veto override, the veto was going to empower the governor, and the veto override made that a qualified power. I think there's significant evidence, important evidence, that they were correct. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.